Welcome back, site members. This is our last presentation of the morning, and right now I'd like to pull into the live stream the Executive Director of the Municipal League of Metro St. Louis, Pat Kelly. Pat, good morning, sir.
Hey, Jeremy, it's great to be here.
Awesome. So, Pat, I know that, there's many site members who work for the municipalities in town, and a lot of them depend on the capital improvement programs that they have for each year. And so I know with COVID, we were concerned about some of those revenue streams, and I believe you're going to go into that in some of your presentation.
Yeah, exactly. We'll take a look at the impact on our local governments and really the trickle down, because at local government, it really is a trickle down from the state and federal government.
Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead and get to it. Thank you, Pat.
Great. It's great to be here, and I don't know if I like following somebody from the Federal Reserve, but I'm going to do my best and hopefully give you some new information and then try to answer any questions as we move forward. So I'm going to look at kind of the pandemic impact on infrastructure investment at the local level. I'm going to take a look at the federal funding, the Highway Trust Fund, and the stimulus packages that are coming down from the federal government, as well as Missouri Future funding. As we're all aware, the first stay-at-home orders, not only in St. Louis County, but throughout the country, really started early to middle of March of last year. The immediate shutdown, because everything was shut down at the same time, the service industries, construction for a very short time, everybody was stay at home. There was a fear, not knowing how long that was going to go on. At the local level, a lot of municipalities were already planning on a 25 to 40% reduction in sales tax, which is really the primary source of revenue for the local municipalities, specifically in St. Louis County. It's interesting to note that the state and local governments represent about 13% of the employment and 9% of the GDP nationally. So if there's a slowdown, or a reduction at the local level, it's really going to impact the overall economy as well. And unlike the federal government, we at the local level, we can't just print more money. So we are dependent on the economic activity within our communities in order to provide those revenues to use for infrastructure projects. Local governments too, I think it's important to understand we are a service industry. We provide services to the residents of our community. And there's certain things that we have to do. We have to provide police, we have to provide fire, we have to provide trash service. And unfortunately, it's those capital improvement projects are the ones that are most flexible. So when there's a concern about an economic downturn or a loss of revenue, the first place they're going to look in order to cut their budgets is really at their capital improvement projects. We did a survey with our municipalities in about middle of May last year to try to get an outlook of where they're going. Across the board, all the municipalities had either stopped or halted most of their capital improvement projects, and we're really looking at curbing them going into the future or into the next year's budget. It was interesting to see the Federal Reserve where you said that the municipal or government infrastructure projects were kind of stable. And I think that the reason being is that the projects that did move forward, or a lot of the activity we've seen over the past or the end of 2020, were really because those projects were already budgeted for. The money was in place, and so those projects could move forward. But it's really the ones going into the future that I think we're going to be more concerned about, more so at the county and state level. The overall economy is again, the presentation before pointed out, is some outlooks are very good. I think at the end of the day, as I had mentioned, the municipalities were predicting huge losses, but really at the end of 2020, most municipalities in St. Louis County were down about 5%, which is really about what the state and also county sales tax were down about that level as well. Now, that's not to say some communities in St. Louis County were hit very hard. And I think without using some of their names, but you can look at them, the ones that are really dependent on one shopping center or very limited retail areas, they were impacted the most. And some of them pretty significantly, upwards, even exceeding 40% in revenue. But overall, again, the U.S. economy was down about $150 billion for state and local governments. That was about 5.5%, which is right where the state in St. Louis County is. But the predictions going forward, as I was mentioning, are also going to be down. So in 2021, economists are predicting, actually an increase, again, 167 billion, almost 5.7%. And then even going into 2022, about 145 billion, and then which is about 4.7%. In the state of Missouri, it was actually kind of interesting this year. The incomes were offset by the first stimulus package, the CARES Act. So state sales tax was actually up about 10%. Total revenue was up about 18%, almost a $1 billion increase. At the local level, I think the reason you saw in St. Louis County that the decrease in sales tax revenue wasn't as impactful as everyone had feared is because the industry shifted. So once things started to loosen up, as you know, we saw almost a boom in home investment. Lumber prices, as mentioned before, skyrocketed. People were, new homes. People are buying new homes and investing in their existing homes. So there was a shift in that industry. And even though all the restaurants and service industries were impacted, I think the most, those dollars that weren't being spent at restaurants were being spent at the grocery store. So people were still buying their food, they were just getting it at different places. So it really wasn't as bad as everybody had anticipated. But at the state level, one of the interesting things when you see that the revenues were up 18%, one of the reasons for that was because they extended the deadline for income tax to be filed. And so by doing so, some of the revenues that should have come in from the previous tax year didn't come in until 2020 year for the state of Missouri. So it's really kind of not as good as it seems. It's going to get caught up as we move forward as revenues decline from that shift. That really is not a good indicator of where the state really is. And the other key factor was the federal funds that were received in the stimulus package. A lot of people don't know, but the first CARES Act package really did not have any funds for local government. And when the act was first initiated, it was only for COVID-related expenses. So really at the local level, that was very limited. In May of last year, the Trump administration loosened the reins on that a little bit and allowed for some reimbursement to local governments for public safety expenses. We worked with St. Louis County, the Municipal League did, and we were able to get $47 million that was distributed to municipalities in St. Louis County on a per capita basis, which really helped offset some of their losses in revenue, but not totally. As many of you know, the St. Louis County is really the economic driver for the state. St. Louis County sales were down, as I mentioned before, right at 5%, 4.9%. What's really interesting about that is retail sales in St. Louis were down at about 11%. And the reason there's a gap between the total sales tax and that retail sales tax level is because A lot of the sales taxes, for instance, Park Stormwater sales tax for St. Louis County isn't collected on pharmaceuticals and food. So there's a big gap between those revenue sources and then retail. So the real impact on the economy for St. Louis as a whole, or on the retail level, I should say, was really at about 11%. And as I mentioned before, municipalities were down about 6% in revenue. I'm going to look a little bit at the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund, finances most the federal spending comes from the Highway Trust Fund. It's kind of interesting that which is again is collected on the fuel tax, the federal fuel tax. Like Missouri, the federal fuel tax hasn't increased since 1993. The stimulus bills include $14 billion in transit agents. This is the proposed package that they were working on and hopefully to roll out if our federal government can come to a consensus. But there's going to be $14 billion for transit agencies, $10 billion for state and highway funding, $2 billion for airport, and $1 billion for Amtrak. That $10 billion in highway funding will be distributed to the states according to the existing appropriation formula. That I think is going to change. That's what they were talking about a month ago. I was hoping, last week they said that President Biden was going to roll out his transportation funding plan this Monday. That didn't happen. In talking to some representatives from MoDOT, they had some meetings earlier this week, and they're hearing now that because of the debate on the current stimulus package and other issues facing our federal government or things that they want to be concerned about, that they probably not going to get to their highway funding formula or package until mid to late summer. The focus is really going to be on infrastructure, but leaning towards green infrastructure as well. How do we? They want to get charging stations and infrastructure that's going to help support moving into a green, electric cars and so forth. In Missouri, in the local level, 2019, Missouri received about $778 million in state highway funding. $104 million was for cities and counties, and $78 million for safety programs and multimodal grants. MoDOT's annual shortfall, as I'm sure many of you know, is about $745 million. In 2020, MoDOT received $61.7 million from the CARES Act funding. But again, it's still a big shortfall from where they need to be. At the Missouri legislature, looking for sources of funding. Again, I don't think this is anybody new, or this isn't new to anybody that I'm talking to or listening to this presentation, because you're all keen to what the state of Missouri and how they approach new taxes and funding for infrastructure, specifically for highways, roads, and bridges. Looking at some of the legislation this year at the state capitol, there's a number of bills in the House to try to increase funding for highway funding or infrastructure, I should say. I can tell you that spending a lot of time in the Capitol, none of the bills in the House are really going to move anywhere. I don't think even any of these bills have had any hearings to this point. In the Senate, Senator Schatz and working with Lieutenant Governor Keough have really continued to be focused on funding for MoDOT and our infrastructure. And this is being backed by the governor as well. As we all know, we worked very hard. Municipal League did, as well as many of you in this industry, on Prop D a few years ago. when the governor and lieutenant governor stepped up to the plate and really backed that proposal on the ballot. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. What they're going to try to do this year at the legislature is to try to actually do something within the legislature so that it doesn't have to go to a vote. And so Senate Bill 262, which was presented by Senator Schatz, and now it's Senate Committee Substitute, Senate Bill 262. We had a meeting on Monday at the state capitol, and Lieutenant Governor and Dave Schatz presented where they are and where they hope to go with this. But currently, the bill would be a 2.5% increase in fuel tax for the next 6 years. Our first 6-year period would mean a total increase of 15 cents. It would one of the key components of this legislation is that consumers would have the ability to seek reimbursement for their fuel tax increase, which is kind of a give and take at the state capitol, so that to get some of what I would call the conservative Republicans on board to support this legislation so that we could do it legislatively. That rebate option would then expire in 2028, and then we would have the tax in place. Some of the things that were talked about at the committee meeting on Monday were some of the trucking industries, and so forth. They have concerns about the fact that it's such a high increase. But again, it's phased in over a 6-year period. And then the other concern is, how does the state capture or tax the electric cars? And really, that's going to be a big concern moving forward, and they really want to get it worked out in this legislation. Ford and GM are saying that they're going to have a complete electric car, or actually all of their cars will be electric no later than 2030 and 2035. And right now there isn't a mechanism, at least in the state of Missouri, in order to collect that fee, like a gas tax, on those electric vehicles, and yet they would still be using the roads and as the other cars do today. So that's going to be a key component, or something that they need to figure out within this legislation. There are a couple other bills that I thought were interesting. Peter Meredith, he wanted to allow the motor fuel tax to be used for public transportation in schools, which is kind of interesting given we already have such a shortfall. And then Representative Don Roan, the bill changed the percentage by which voters on a local motor fuel tax must pass by 2/3 instead of a simple majority for those jurisdictions that have the ability to impose a local tax. Before we get to questions, I did want to make a couple more comments. The current stimulus package that is on the table at the federal government, if it were to come out today, there would be a direct pass-through to the municipalities for some support. Unfortunately, the way they have it designed right now, in the state of Missouri, there'd be about $2.5 billion just for local governments, for municipal governments. But they're going to base the distribution on development block grant fund allocations. And for those of you that don't know that, these are funds that are allocated through HUD to local municipalities based on need, based on low-income areas within your community, and based on being able to use those funds to invest in those low-income areas. So for a lot of municipalities in St. Louis County, that's a very limited resource. I can speak specifically to the city of Brentwood. They receive about $20,000 a year in development block grant funds. And the city of Ladue probably doesn't receive any. So those communities probably would not receive any additional funding from this next stimulus package. But a city like St. Louis, the estimate for St. Louis is that they would receive almost $450 million in this stimulus package as a municipality, and then about another $58 million for their county allocation. St. Louis County government would receive about $194 million under the current package, and that these sources of revenue would go into general revenue, which is, again, different from the original CARES Act, which was only those stimulus package could only be spent on COVID-related expenses. So those would really help the county and obviously the city of St. Louis. Going forward, I still think we're going to see at least some caution as municipalities move forward. They're spending on their capital improvement projects, specifically, roadways and bridges. I think that's going to continue probably for the next 2 years. So with that, I'd be more than happy to try to answer any questions if anybody has any.
All right. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for the presentation. There are no questions in the queue. I think, Pat, one of the questions that, and it's come up a number of different times is, are there municipalities out there that are still holding back projects that went to bid, and will those get released, or are they holding off until there's more funding mechanisms in place? And what are you hearing on that?
Well, again, it's kind of interesting. Some of the cities' revenues are actually up. Because and I used to be the mayor of Brentwood. I'm not gonna, but I'm not just pointing them out. But they have a very diverse retail base, and so their revenues are up. They're doing a major $80 million project that is moving ahead, and will continue over the next few years, which is a huge flood mitigation project. But then other cities, are impacted and they're just holding the reins back. I think overall in St. Louis County, cities are still kind of on a wait and see. They want to make sure that the revenues are going to be in place in order for them to provide those day-to-day services for the municipality or for their residents. So, they want to make sure that they're going to be able to have the resources to fund their police and fire and trash. And then, once they a little bit more comfortable, I think they'll loosen the reins a little bit and proceed with some of those projects.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's always on the mind of the contractors. They do a lot of work for the municipalities here. A lot of our members do. So good to hear that. And we hope that, there's some consensus on a stimulus bill and that we can get some of these funding mechanisms in place so we can move forward with some capital improvement projects. So thank you again to Pat Kelly. Looking forward to seeing you in the future.